Jesus. If I could just hold still. There's a couple. See them wiggling around in there, spazzing out, just like their dad. They got my eyes. Got their mother's antennas. They're attracted to light. So every time that fills up, that little spot, whoa, maniac. Been siphoning them off, putting them in a tank, try and grow them out. But the eggs are old too. I didn't think they were gonna work, but they still did. Oh yeah, there's a few spazzing out over here.
Exhausted Captain Frank Gavin.
Just like their dad. It's fucking spaz.
These Australian officers that's been fighting like the devil for weeks. And now remember, he's
still microscopic. They're like the size of a grain of sand.
Smith continues, quote,
they'll molt in 24 hours, apparently they'll shed, and then be like double that size, and then you can start feeding them.
Have been irregular and inadequate. They have been constantly in contact with the enemy,
light.
And they feel that they have been badly let down. I feel that too.
So I keep sucking them out and putting them in a tank, so you don't want to get all those, all the shells.
There are incidents that people
shells are bad, so you siphon off
one in Smith's book that
little shits instead of
that just is one of those things that reminds you, combat's one of those things that's sort of on a spectrum. And on one end of the spectrum, it's called like the 10 or the 1, whichever however it does it. On one end of the spectrum is the heroic
keep that water oxygen in, keep them moving, or else they won't hatch.
And then themes of soldierly conduct going back to Ajax and Achilles and Homer and all that. But I mean, the Schwarzenegger, Stallone, Face Off, whatever it might be. And that stuff happens. People listening to my voice now have probably been involved in those kinds of things, right? That level of fighting. Now, if you go
they're surviving in the other tank, I hope.
You go with freaking heroism and all that stuff. You get to the other aspect of combat. The pathetic, not ennobling.
Leaving the baby in the hot car.
Leaves a stain on the victims and the victimizers. And one of these incidents involves the Australians on Singapore running to some degree.
Now, the empty shells will float.
For a second before I go into this, because
the ones that haven't hatched yet will sink.
These guys had just been acting as a rear guard for the rest of their unit, so they're the ones holding off the enemy. So the rest of their forces
eating on my fucking
the enemy they're holding off happen to be elements of the Japanese Imperial Guard, and at a certain point, the Imperial Guard elements will outnumber the Australian rear guard elements. And then the about the bayonets charge.
Fucking Crispies.
This is all happening.
Eat a whole box of that in one bowl. I love that shit. I don't know what it is, but Rice Krispies I fucking love.
Terrain. Smith picks up the narrative, and he got it from
big spoonful of sugar.
The remembrances of a Japanese corporal who was a member of the Imperial Guard. So he wrote about this incident. Smith sort of translates it for us and writes, quote, "The Imperial Guard, having passed through the torments of Buddhist temples, whatever it means, the torments of Buddhist temples, had their blood up and were looking for revenge. First Corporal Sushikani, I hope I pronounced that correctly, was involved in a grenade duel with the Australian rear guard. In his excitement, the baseball pitching skills he had acquired at senior high school almost undid him, because he threw the first one much too long and was nearly killed by the pineapple.
Yeah, they'll continue to probably hatch for like another 24 hours or so.
And rolled within 2 meters
supposed to have an air stone in there, having a bubble.
The second one he got right. Then they all charged with fixed bayonets. Some of the Australians, now badly outnumbered, started running. Sushikani chased one down, pushed him to the ground, and heard a, quote, deathly yell as he impaled him with his bayonet, and then withdrew the blade. The corporal noticed that others were neither running nor fighting." Now directly quoting the corporal, quote, "Having lost their nerve, some soldiers were simply cowering in terror, squatting down and avoiding the hand-to-hand combat in a wait-and-see position. They too were bayoneted or shot without mercy." End quote. That's the pathetic side of combat, where you just feel like here you have a bunch of people that are trapped in a place and a time. And you see this over and over again. And if this is considered to be the troops not doing a good account of themselves or what have you, you want to just, like the soldier that said, but they feel like they've been let down, you just want to flip somebody off, don't you? How about you get the aircraft out of the skies and make them stop strafing us all the time, and maybe we won't run so quickly when we're charged with bayonets by the Imperial Guard that outnumbers us? I don't know. Within a short period of time, the Japanese have advanced into a position where at first they start to threaten the water supply of Singapore, and then they begin to capture those places. And now you have a humanitarian disaster looming. The letters between Churchill and the commanders locally begin to soften.
It doesn't seem like they're drawing the light as much as they were earlier. I wonder if the water's getting messed up.
Will end up having to accept surrender conditions where the British are photographed carrying a white flag.
They say you put them in the
and
fridge and
surrendering.
they'll stay
I
alive
think
for
if
like
it's
4
not the
days.
largest, it's one of the
I wouldn't think
largest
that would be
number
true,
of
you know?
Imperial
That's
troops
so
to
weird.
a foe in the British Army's history. Oh yeah, and there's more atrocities while all this is going on. I don't know to what depth to go into the atrocities. There's a famous, another one of the hospital
Mexican
attacks, like the one in Hong
jumping
Kong.
beans,
This
just
one will see
vibrate around.
upwards of 150, closer to maybe 200 victims. Once again, we have the rapes, we have the bayoneting of wounded soldiers in their cots. It's awful stuff. And the 80,000 or so Allied troops that have to surrender to the Japanese on February 15th, 1942, will be carted
Start to
off
get some eggs off the bottom and squirt them in the tank, because they can still very easily hatch. But you don't want the ones that are floating, because they're already hatched.
And needless to say that while those troops will go off and suffer for several years in captivity, including General Percival, by the way, off to captivity himself, the citizens, all the different ethnic groups, the Chinese, the Malays, all the people in Singapore are all going to suffer under the Japanese occupation there too. There are books written, some of them just in Chinese, that diagram on a regular basis the local homicides and rapes and mistreatment at the hands of the new colonizers, right? The ones that are doing it under the banner of Asia for the Asians. They didn't say it was going to be nice necessarily, and it's not going to be. Churchill earlier had been embarrassed and said that, this was a shock that we can't perform better when the Russians are doing amazing feats and dying to the last man against the Germans. They're doing so well in the Philippines and Luzon. Well, there are some differences, because the Luzon stuff, all the Philippine stuff, is happening simultaneously with the stuff going on in Singapore and Malaya and everything. But there are some key differences. First of all, the whole campaign really kicks off a little later, like 2 weeks later. Troops land instantly, but I think it's the 22nd, 23rd or something of December 1941, when like 40,000 Japanese troops land on the big island, Luzon, where Manila is. And then everything gets real right away. But unlike Malaya, where there are few or no tanks, one or the other. Some people say few, but every place used to just say there are no tanks in Malaya. There are tanks in the Philippines, and it makes a very big difference against the Japanese tanks that are landed, right? If only the Imperial troops had had a bunch of tanks in Malaya, even bad ones. These aren't big monster tanks that you're going to get later in the war. A lot of them are light tanks, but listen, just glad to have anything, and they give good service, because with the Americans and the Philippines continually getting pushed back, the same way the Imperial forces are, right, infiltration, being outflanked, amphibious outflanking, the whole thing.
Practice with this and try and get good at it.
Other troops will be able to provide some sort of cover that allow, in this case, the Allied troops or the Americans and the Filipinos, to pull back and not get rolled up momentum-wise. They're able to stop and consolidate for a minute, which allows a more sort of vigorous and stubborn defense. In Malaya, the Imperial forces never got a chance to stabilize. The other difference in the Philippines, it's going to be different, is you don't have General Percival in charge of things. You have Douglas MacArthur in charge of things. And that is a very different animal, well, any way you slice it. To go from talking about Churchill inordinately to going and talking about MacArthur like we're about to, makes me feel like we're completely embracing the great man theory of history. We're just going from one great, usually male figure, to another, dominating the historical scene at will, standing astride history like a colossus. But, that's an old theory. I mean, Greeks and Romans all great men moved the world and whatnot. And then there's all kinds of other theories that have cropped up since the trends and forces one. Okay, that unless the conditions, for example, are set up correctly for one to rise. And then if they are set up correctly, one will rise. My counterpoint to that, because I have to believe the trends and forces, but I believe it interacts with the great man theory, my counterpoint is, but the figure that arises because of the trend and forces of the time doesn't have to be a quirky nut, right? He didn't say he had to be weird, he just said time was right for somebody. And to me, that's where you put the personal stamp on the whole trends and forces thing. I feel similarly with MacArthur, because he's a fabulous, but his personality is actually going to impact how the whole war is wars fought and why things go the way they do. You turn around and go, well, wait a minute. Even if the trends and forces make it just perfectly right for a guy like MacArthur to rise, they didn't have to produce a guy like MacArthur. This, just so we make it perfectly clear, is a diva. And he's a diva in the way, you know, it's funny, every sort of group of people that has a diva class amongst them, whatever they may be, singers, actresses, whatever it might be, generals are another one of those types where they just produce these prima donnas. It was once said by somebody that I that one of the great gifts that Eisenhower had when he was the commander of Allied forces in Europe was that he was the one guy who could sort of mediate between a group of prima donna Allied generals who were tough to coordinate, interact, and get to work together, the Pattons and the Montgomerys and all those guys. Martha Gellhorn, who was a Second World War war correspondent, married to Ernest Hemingway for a while, definitely one of the more interesting journalistic figures in war correspondence, and needless to say, a very early woman on the scene, and tough as nails, and she went to all these places, talked to all these people in all these governments and systems, and she said, and I'm quoting from memory, but she basically said that the politicians and the generals are the same everywhere you go. It doesn't matter what the political system is or anything, they're a type. And it made me think that either the kind of people who are going to turn out, or likely to turn out, or most of the time turn out to be prima donnas and divas in a military sense, are those the kind of guys that have the drive to become generals in the first place, or does it attract those kind of people? Or does being a general and all the perks that come along with that turn you into a military diva? I don't know, but MacArthur is the best example of type you'll ever see. He's a caricature of himself. And he's been lampooned for his sort of type more than anybody I've ever seen. I mean, from MASH to The Simpsons, everybody, they got the corncob pipe, smoking, dark sunglasses, I mean, iron-jawed. I mean, MacArthur is a unique figure, but he's weird. I mean, I have a line in the sand, psychologically speaking, where on the far side of that line, I can't say what you have, I just know you're on the far side of the line, and most of us normal people are on this side of the line. And the dividing line is people who seriously refer to themselves regularly in the third person. I don't know what it means to do that, but MacArthur's on the far side of that line because he does that. He's one of these people, though, that it's hard to, I mean, what makes him really interesting is not that he's weird like that, but that he kind of lives up to the hype of his own imagination also. And here's the way historian Craig L. Simons runs down, you know, a little bit of this guy's background. He's sort of the golden child from the time he first appears on the military scene. And Simons writes, quote, Douglas MacArthur was then and remains today a lightning rod for both admirers and critics. The only child of General Arthur MacArthur, who had been awarded the Medal of Honor for his heroism on Missionary Ridge during the Civil War, the younger MacArthur had been something of a celebrity, even during his cadet days at West Point, where he graduated first in the class of 1903. During the First World War, he had performed brilliantly, returning from the war in 1919 as a 39-year-old brigadier general with 2 Distinguished Service Crosses and no fewer than 7 Silver Stars.
Jesus.
He became West Point superintendent. Then in 1930, at the age of 50, he became the U.S. Army Chief of Staff. End quote. MacArthur had a mixed reputation amongst troops. Depends on who you ask. Like, there were a bunch of troops that had a sour taste in their mouth because it was MacArthur who, with an extremely forceful hand, broke up some, well, they became riots, I guess you could say, but there was a long-term protest during the Hoover administration by people during the Depression who were veterans and who wanted their veteran bonus payments given out to them earlier than originally specified because, well, it was the Great Depression. And MacArthur, you know, these are all veterans. MacArthur sort of crushed this encampment, the bonus marchers they were called, roughly, and there were people that held that against him forever afterwards. And then there were people like Eisenhower, and it depends on what you read from Eisenhower, because you can find him saying good things and bad things. I mean, he thought MacArthur's mind was crazy interesting and good, but at the same time that the guy was over-dramatic. Well, Simons continues, he talks about the other side, right, that goes with MacArthur as this glittering golden child from Long ago, almost like born to the role from a military hero father, and Simon writes, quote, "Then there was the man himself. In addition to his obvious intellectual gifts, MacArthur's personal demeanor included an all-too-evident self-regard that put off many of his contemporaries. He seemed ever conscious of himself as a historical figure, and frequently behaved, even in private, as if he were declaiming from a stage, pacing back and forth and gesturing theatrically with his corncob pipe. He discounted, even disparaged, the opinions of others, and saw criticism as less disagreement than treason. As the historian Max Hastings put it, now quoting Hastings, quote, MacArthur's belief that his critics were not merely wrong, but evil, verged on derangement. Simons continues, quote, these characteristics repelled many of the men he had to work with, including King and Nimitz. MacArthur had an astonishing memory, a deep knowledge of history, and a quick and incisive mind. It remained to be seen, however, if he also possessed the diplomatic sensitivity to orchestrate the land, air, and sea forces of several countries, a skill so evident in his former aide, Dwight Eisenhower. End quote. I personally don't think that there's any doubt that this guy had what it took to do any of these monumental things in terms of his raw talent and the polishing of the diamond that he had done since he was young. This is a very accomplished, very gifted person, but with it comes the rest of this package. And it's interesting as heck. In his great book, Rampage, MacArthur, Yamashita, and the Battle of Manila, author James M. Scott tries to flesh out the MacArthur figure, and he quotes several people who were talking about the great brain, right? He's brilliant man, genius, these generals are all saying. He quotes Philip La Follette, who served on MacArthur's staff, as saying, quote, his mind was a beautiful piece of almost perfect machinery, end quote. So everybody admires this guy's brain, but it's weird being alone with him and having him refer to himself in the third person. Scott quotes Dwight Eisenhower as saying about the experience, quote, the sensation was unusual. In time I got used to it and saw it not as objectionable, just odd. He then goes on to say that the word discuss or discussion is not the right word to use when you're having a discussion with MacArthur. It's more like a monologue. And he had an interesting way of talking that in a way fleshes out the character. It's like those theater folk who come off stage and they still sound like they're on stage when they talk, like very dramatic, using maybe archaic words. MacArthur used archaic words. Scott quotes a journalist trying to get you a sense of the way MacArthur talked, and he says, quote, he often used archaic words and terms, as one might a rare spice for extraordinary flavor, end quote. Well, that explains President Roosevelt's line, also quoted in Scott's book. Roosevelt said that he talks in a voice that might come from an oracle's cave. Well, if you spice it up with those archaic words and terms, speak of yourself in the third person, and use almost like a stage voice, well, yeah, you sound like an oracle. You just know how to play to the crowd, right? But it's a weird part of the guy's character. Makes him more interesting as a historical figure, but then, of course, I don't have to work with him. This is a person who also knows how to use the media of his time. I mean, Twitter or any of the other social media outlets have been around in his day. He'd have 1 billion followers. He had his own direct pipeline from the Philippines where he was commanding to the U.S. media outlets who were hungrily waiting for any info he gave. And when he provided that info, most of the time it only mentioned a single person, him. Historian Ronald H. Spector in Eagle Against the Sun writes about the MacArthur press machine and says, quote, MacArthur's great stature in the United States was in part due to his own highly efficient public relations organization. Most of the war news from the Philippines, which the American public read, came from MacArthur's communiques and press releases. Of 142 communiques released by his headquarters between December and March, 109 mentioned only one individual, MacArthur, end quote. Spector then quotes another historian that points out that MacArthur had a way of getting his name into the press releases in multiple places, even when it's not about him particularly. Like instead of saying the U.S. Army's right flank on Bataan, the press release would say, MacArthur's right flank's on Bataan. And instead of saying something like, the 10th Regiment's soldiers, it says, MacArthur's men. And that historian said the communiques omitted the names of combat units, commanders, and individuals who had performed exceptional exploits. MacArthur also had this other side, which was something, was part of the rumor mill back in Washington, D.C. between the two world wars. I mean, MacArthur was accused of going Oriental, as it was called at one point, wearing kimonos around the office, fanning himself with a Japanese fan, and smoking from a jeweled cigarette holder. Just an interesting guy all the way around. The problem is that there has always been a spectrum of views on MacArthur. And on one end of the spectrum are the MacArthur groupies, the superfans, and they are the people who buy into MacArthur's worldview, that he's been stabbed in the back by everyone from the U.S. Navy to multiple presidents, whatever it might be, that this was the greatest soldier in American history, that he was the person who was in the right in those confrontations with the presidents, and in fact should have been the president someday himself. And then on the far opposite end of the scale, you have the people who think, and this was always part of the lampooning when I was a kid in the 1970s, that MacArthur is sort of delusional, that the real world is sort of blocked from his vision through the cataract of his own greatness, and he's kind of like blithely out of it. Sometimes you'll see him issue orders too. In Hero Heroes, where Francis Pike has some of this he deals with, he'll issue these orders that are, or make these demands on Washington that are so out of touch with reality that you wonder about the man himself. For example, in the early days of the fighting on the Philippines after the Pearl Harbor attack, MacArthur is urging Washington to strike the Japanese home islands now with naval assets right away, since they're all occupied fighting him. Well, this is delusional, because that's the same time that the Navy's telling Roosevelt they can't even defend the Philippines. Forget about launching a strike on the Japanese home islands. Pike also quotes Admiral Hart, who was the naval commander of U.S. assets in the Philippines and who worked closely with MacArthur between the wars, and who considered himself a friend of MacArthur until the war got close and the friendship broke down. And Pike quotes Admiral Hart as telling his wife that he's not sure MacArthur is, quote, altogether sane, end quote. And then he adds that he may not have been altogether sane for some while now. What does that even mean? I've read a ton about Douglas MacArthur over my lifetime, and I still find him as a figure completely impenetrable. I don't know how to process this idea that maybe he's this out-of-touch thing living in his own world, like a Mr. Magoo stumbling on from one military good thing to another triumph. He's going to do a lot of things in the rest of his life that seem like really hard things to do under the best of conditions. I would think if you weren't grounded in reality, they would be impossible. That's just my view. At the same time, this guy is so complicated that sometimes it's difficult to know how you feel about him, unless you find yourself unreservedly on one of the two polarities on the guy. There's another way of looking at him too, just a crazy like Fox way. We mentioned earlier, how many Twitter followers this guy would have, how well he used the media of the day. Well, how much of this is all for publicity purposes, right? I had a buddy who said, is he putting us on? Eisenhower said about his old boss that he would have been a great actor, and that he studied dramatics under him for 7 years, basically, when he worked for him. Is this all part of branding? Right? Maybe you think about it this way. Maybe MacArthur's positioning himself for an eventual presidential run, and this is all part of the brand. And before you dismiss it out of hand, some writers and historians over the years have made similar charges against other public figures from that time. Churchill, even, for example. The cigar, the ever-present booze, the hat, the V sign. You could put it on a poster, couldn't you? Wonderful brand. You know exactly who you're dealing with. It serves two purposes. It promotes Churchill personally, and whatever cause he wants to push at the same time. Well, if Churchill can do it, MacArthur can do it, so maybe it's a put-on? My response to that is, I'm a cynical, all those kind of things I see right through. This is the kind of put-on that would work even for me. And it's possible it's geared toward working on people exactly like me. Let me tell you one of my favorite MacArthur stories, and it'll just give you an idea of how hard this guy is to pin down for this kind of stuff. So he gets accused of not visiting the troops